when they visited a doctor for a checkup, before they were born. The second one also before the baby came. The biggest payment when the baby was born, and then 2 more payments if the mother went to the doctor with the baby. So that, whereas otherwise, a lot of women after the first child would perhaps say, well, I know all that, and not go. This was an incentive to go every time. And by the way, the second baby, we didn't get it. We weren't able to get the ambulance, so we had to take a taxi, and that was also paid. Everything was paid. And I should, this didn't only affect mothers, but also me as a father. I came down with hepatitis and landed in the hospital 9 weeks until my bilirubin level was low enough, and they would let me go after 9 weeks, but sent me to a rehabilitation sanatorium, which was on the beautiful, beautiful grounds of the Siemens family. You know, the huge Siemens electrical. They had been thrown out, and this was now for everybody. So that was 4 weeks, all expenses paid. That means transportation, food, lodging, all the bubble baths and mud baths and everything else I had to do, and therapy, plus getting 90% of my wages, of my pay. A year later, because of possible liver damage, I was sent again to 4 weeks, but this time in Carlsbad in Czechoslovakia, Karlovy Vary, also for treatment. And again, all expenses paid, everything, and your wage. My wife had 3 such cures for rheumatism. One of them in Poland, one in the mountains in the GDR, and one in the flatland, but also very nice. And as I say, this was all free. All prescription medicine. If the doctor prescribed it, it was free. You went to a pharmacy, there was no money changed hands in a pharmacy, unless if you wanted to get certain things, or in such places, if you wanted to get Dio, something like that, or if you wanted, for example, fancy glass frames, or color, or sunglasses, which weren't prescribed, that's paid for. But all prescription drugs, and all dental care, with one exception, if you wanted gold teeth, they had to pay the gold yourself. But otherwise, this was all free. And to add to this, well, also child care free. Education free. My college education was free, and that of my sons was not only free, but they got, I think it was 200 marks a month, which covered all basic food and lodging expenses, and a trip home if they wanted to, when they had it. It wasn't an awful lot, but it was enough to cover everything, which meant that there was no such thing as student debt, and there was no such thing as working alongside your studies. Nobody worked while studying, that I ever saw, in any case. Most important, I think, however, was that there was never, you could not be fired. Everybody's job was safe. When you talk to you, are you afraid of losing your job? Sometimes I ask that sort of provocatively. They just laughed at me, because there's always a shortage of labor. There were always help wanted signs all over the damn place. Well, I'm sorry, in the church I shouldn't be using such words. But this meant that there was a more relaxed feeling in most places of work. They were not fearful of losing their job, ever. Unless they committed a crime, and then the union had to approve if they were thrown out. This meant, for example, that people went to the dentist on company time during the workday. They went to the doctor during workday. They even went, and I think they sometimes even went to the hairdresser during work time. But I know that they went to the little shops that they had. In every larger factory had a shop where they had groceries, but since they were usually better supplied than outside for the workers, it meant that you could get things you couldn't get outside, which explained. I couldn't understand why all my so I worked in a factory also for 5 or 6 months as a laborer. what surprised me, nobody had anything like a lunchbox, like people do, working people do in the States. They all had briefcases like a lawyer has. I couldn't understand that, although the briefcases were pretty battered, until I realized that if they happen to have imported lemons or raisins or fresh cherries or something like that, was fitted, almost anything fitted in those briefcases except a watermelon. So that was explained. In any case, this feature of GDR life endeared me to the GDR. One of the basic things. Another basic thing was that I found very soon that the entire atmosphere was anti-fascist. The Nazis were thrown out. They were thrown. Most teachers had been Nazis. My wife told me bitter stories of the brutal types that taught, and with corporal punishment, and nasty. And they were all thrown out, and they had new teachers who were mostly hardly equipped. Some of you know this because I've written about it. I apologize to those who this isn't new, but my brother-in-law was one of these. He was a prisoner of war. When he returned, they said to him, you always liked football, didn't you? Or soccer, of course. You always liked to play, and he was an enthusiastic soccer player. Wouldn't you like to take a sports class in the school? And of course, he had no training at all in any teaching. But he said, well, okay. So he became what was known as a new teacher, Neulehrer in German. And before long, they said, maybe you could also teach geography. And after that, I think they added history. And of course, he's always just a couple of steps ahead of his pupils in learning all this. Later, gradually, they were able to build up a store, and he took over crafts and sports. But he and another brother-in-law were this new teacher generation who were they hadn't had much education in pedagogics, but they were anti-fascist. And this group of new teachers remained a central feature in the schools after, gradually with the change of generations, the next young teachers who came in did not have the experience of the war and fascism, and they were just telling, just like teachers now would teach about the Civil War, the World War II, but there was this core, which was the last of them who were still teaching, were all thrown out in 1990. But I'll get to that before ending. But this anti-fascists being thrown out meant the judges all had been Nazis, all thrown out. The cops, the same. In all administrative levels, there was some minor people who had not really been guilty of anything except just joining. Some slipped through, and once in a while somebody slips through and able to cover up their past. But well over, closing in on 100%, they threw these Nazis out. And the whole atmosphere in East Germany, which often, I think, purposely turned around in the Western press, media, in the East, in the USA as in West Germany, as if West Germany had regretted the Nazi period and had really turned over a new leaf, whereas East Germany hadn't. It was really just exactly the opposite. And I worked for a while with a newspaper, an English language newspaper, which exposed this, and exposed that West Germany was dominated from the very start, not by the top Nazi layer. Some of them got hung, a lot of them got away. They went to South America, or some went to Washington, and some of them just ducked under until things eased up, which was after 1950, 51. But all the other levels were dominated by Nazis, and this was symbolized. This little newspaper I helped put out for 5 years, Democratic German Report, investigated this and found, for example, this was our best coup, the diplomats. We found, we had a map made, and in every country where the ambassador from West Germany had been a member of the Nazi party, we put a swastika. And I don't know, if you can't see it from there, very outside there, maybe it'll give you a tiny impression that the whole map is covered with swastikas, except not so much Africa because there weren't so many independent countries there. But every one of their ambassadors had been a Nazi Party member. Some had nominally not done anything terribly bad. Some were vicious characters. One of them we found had reported from Holland after the invasion of Holland. He boasted to Berlin, in the last 11 months we've been able to eradicate 1/3 of the Jews of Holland already completely. And this guy that was in 1943. In 1962, he was ambassador to Switzerland. After this expose, he, as well as the ambassador to the United States, who was thrown out too by John F. Kennedy, by the way, when this came out, and to London, and lots of others had to be thrown out. The one to Switzerland, who this real vicious character, they transferred him, they made him ambassador to Argentina. In any case, this difference between the Nazis basically running the roost in West Germany and East Germany is one of the key points which endeared the GDR to me. And underlying this, it wasn't only the people in such jobs. More important was huge companies and combines which controlled the economy. In West Germany, it was back to Siemens, Krupp, the arms manufacturer. You may not know it. You know how that Krupp company became wealthy at first? They built the wheel frames, the seat steel wheel frames for the conquest of the American West. I had never known that. But then they turned to weapons, and they built weapons for every war that Germany was in after the 1860s. But worst of all, perhaps, the chemical companies, then known as IG Farben, but later separated, Bayer and BASF are now the two biggest chemical companies in the world. Their leaders were responsible directly for Auschwitz. Some of the top men built and ran Auschwitz and were responsible for all the killings. And some of them were sentenced to life, some of them got off free, some were sentenced to 5 or 10 years, but all of them were amnestied in 1950-51. And one of them, for example, became the head of Bayer again, who had been directly in Auschwitz. But nobody knew this. We exposed it as best we could. That endeared me too. And the fact that these big companies who came to rule the roost, and also the big auto companies, Daimler, the one which makes BMW, that's Quant, Porsche, or you call it Porsche, I think, but we call it German is Porsche, and Volkswagen, they were all back in. The same, all of them had used slave laborers by the 10,000s, even really by together by the millions, and hundreds of thousands had died. They had been terribly overworked with no food. It was just a minimum of food, terrible condition, and these guys were all back. So these are the things which made, and the GDR had thrown them all out, confiscated every bit of it. This to me was a basic fact of life, why I stayed with the GDR in my feelings. Now I have to say this was not always easy, because the GDR faced an awful lot of problems. I'm talking too long, all right?
No. This is great.
I'll try to wind up as quickly as I can. The GDR had every card stacked against it in 1945 when it was divided into zones. It was the much smaller part of Germany, about 1/3. It was much poorer. It had almost no natural resources except a very rotten kind of a half coal, which it had to use. It had almost nothing else. It had potash salt. That was the only other resource. They had nothing. They were dependent on imports for almost everything. But they had only one steel mill, whereas West Germany had, I think, up to 50. They had a developed chemical industry and a couple of machine tool and textile. But here they were dependent on import of cotton They were dependent on imported iron. It was a tough job, and it was not easy. And gradually, I saw, however, over the years, how they built up basically a prosperous economy in which everybody had enough. There were always shortages of something, which got people angry. They always cursing, as something was always missing. There was this one joke which said to the person, the shop clerk says to the customer, "I'm sorry, sir, this is the shop where we don't have tennis shoes. Next door is the shop where they don't have jerseys." This is one of the many, many jokes. And people in the East saw this much richer commodity system in the West, which was pumped full by the United States in the Marshall Plan, which had the natural resources, which had the investments of Siemens and all these others, which they didn't have, the East had to pay reparations, which the West did not. The East had to pay Poland and the Soviets, who were completely wrecked by the war, had to pay over 95% of reparations were paid by the East, whereas the West had been obliged for France, Netherlands, and Belgium, who quickly said it's okay, now it's enough, and cut it. All these things, and yet they built up this economy, which I would say is the only economy I know of in the whole world which basically abolished poverty. There were some who didn't have it so good, certain groups, especially women who had lost their husbands in the war or had never found husbands and had never learned a trade. They had been housewives. And they worked at cleaning and such jobs which didn't require skill, and therefore their pensions were lower than for most people. So that if they didn't have children who helped them, or they could always do an extra job if they wanted some easy job. But even they, first of all, they paid no more tax for health. That was, when you were, as a woman 60, a man 65, you no longer had to pay for medical care. You know, that percentage. They got that free. They couldn't be thrown, in other words, all medical dental care was free. Prescription drugs were free. They couldn't be thrown out of their homes. There was always, the main meal in Germany is not supper, but lunch. And every factory and every school is committed to supplying a hot lunch to everybody. And also for the pensioners, there were clubs and places where they got for almost for nothing, for something like 1 mark or something. They get a hot lunch and a place to meet and to gather and so forth. But there was terrible problems, and the biggest problem was that people always looked to the West, which was beaming in on TV all the time its propaganda, how wonderfully they lived. Not only in West Germany, but in the United States, in such programs as Dallas, which some people may remember, this wonderful life that these oil barons were living. A lot of people in East Germany thought, that's how people live in the West. Wouldn't it be nice to live that way too? And this was one of the main motivations why they were they wanted to unite with West Germany so they'd have that too. And this feeling, which was always strengthened by every evening you got it on television, how wonderfully they had it and how badly we had it. Very clever propaganda. It was a combination of Goebbels propaganda and Madison Avenue here. And the GDR never caught up with that, partly and because its leaders, and they stayed leaders in very strict, it was a tight hierarchical structure up to the top. But they were made up of men, almost only men, I'm afraid, on the top level, with some exceptions, who had fought the Nazis, who had been in Spain, who had been imprisoned in the camps and penitentiaries, or who had been in exile, some of them in the Danish underground or the Dutch underground. They were born anti-Nazi, but this hardens people, such a life. It not only hardens them, but it makes them fearful if there's a change. What will happen not only to us, but to all our ideals and principles of building up socialism, which resulted in I would say, sad lack of rapport, of connection with a large portion of the population and with media, which, with many exceptions which were good, but by and large tending to boring, no controversy, just the line with lots of protocol titles and so forth, which people didn't want to read, basically. You know, they look at the headlines and they turn around and look at the sports, and then they look at the obituaries. And that was about it, mostly. They never really learned to talk to the people. And this, plus that desire for good new cars. We had these little cars, two-stroke, very simple. People dreamed of having an Opel or a VW, or maybe some of them dreamed of maybe a Mercedes or a BMW too, but they dreamed. And then the shortages, we had shortages of imported things which were hard to import, which included southern fruits. Oranges were hard to get, basically only at Christmas time. Bananas were extremely rare. That was one of the big jokes, that people dreamed of bananas. And to this day, the East Germans eat more bananas than anybody else in Europe. It's still more, because you couldn't get bananas. And in some places, sometimes it was what happened in 1989-90, when they united Germany. They called it the Banana Revolution. Of course, many people felt suffocated because of the stuffiness, because there was censorship of books and so forth. Although, despite the censorship, and partly because of the censorship, the best writers wrote in ways which get through the censorship, which meant that some who were anti-GDR had to disguise that, but those who were for the GDR, but critical, they also had to get a way to get it printed. And this made for extremely interesting literature to analyze it. People went into the bookshops, got one of these shopping baskets. The books were so cheap, they were dirt cheap, like records, and theater and opera were dirt cheap. They'd take books without looking at the price, and fill up their book basket, and hope that maybe they'll find one of the special books, these more critical books, which were very interesting and well written, our best authors, but which were usually so popular that they kept them hidden behind the counter, only for relatives and favorites, you know, and regular customers. Those were called stoop goods, because they had to stoop down to get to them. You could get them in the library too, but there was a long, long wait. In any case, the bad side, the GDR had economic problems based on trying to keep up with the West militarily, which was impossible. But they had to keep up more or less, they felt. This cost billions. Second of all, they needed electronics to sell machine tools, for example. Electronics, the Soviets had them, but couldn't give them to the GDR, or didn't. They needed them for space and their own military. The West was forbidden to give to the East. It meant little GDR had to compete with IBM and Sony, which cost billions, and of course they never could really do it. And third of all, they had a giant housing program to give every family or every person in the GDR a decent modern home. That meant with central heating, with full sanitation and everything, which a lot of people didn't have, by 1990. And that program, which never was completed quite, was cost billions. And in general, the whole economy, you could see in the 1980s going downhill, and the tensions growing, which meant, of course, Stasi more worried about people who opposed opposition, which was always there, underground, and this state security